Hello and welcome to Ask an Analyst. I'm Falko. I'm the head of business development and customer success at GameAnalytics, and I'm a lot in touch with our users, with the studios and publishers using the tool. And we've received very interesting questions from our users in our community. And helping me answer those questions today will be Clara Livingston from the New York Times Games Department. And welcome, Clara. Thank you for joining the show. And can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, I'm Clara. I work at the Times. I focus on our new games and new products, determining success in that area. I moved from our mobile growth team almost a year ago to take this on and really think about and develop how we evaluate success when it comes to any new betas we're thinking about or new apps we might be releasing, like Crossplay, which came out earlier this year. So it's been, very fun. Think about it a lot every day. It is my job. And, it's been such a blast.
Yeah, we are excited to be having you. We can just jump straight into the question that, as always, we received from our community, and then we can discuss this in detail. But of course, if you want your question to be featured in one of the future episodes, please reach out to us, drop it in the comments, and we'll get to it with another guest in the future. So for today, we have: how can we tell early on whether a new game concept has a real potential? So the studio that sent this in, they're working on a Match 3 prototype, and they started analyzing early player data. But with some of the metrics looking positive, the overall signals are a little bit mixed. So how do you run analysis for games in this early stage? How do you determine if you have like a hit or a dud on your hands as early as possible? Do you have any general thoughts to start out with?
I have a lot of thoughts about this. I think a lot about what does it mean to be a success. So I was coming up with a list of things that I would consider, like what would be healthy habits for determining this. I think the one that appealed or came to mind the most was like the benefit of a North Star and a benefit of a benchmark to start. Like if that's all you have, you kind of need to agree on what is it that we consider success? What metric do we consider as being our success? And what does that sort of line indicate? Because I think it's really easy to convince yourself that like your game is doing well if you don't set these types of things. You can sort of lose the thread on how your game is actually going. And like the thing is, not all of them can be priorities. So you have to be like really critical in sort of ranking these. And at the time, we care a lot about retention. So when we are testing new games, like we had an app come out earlier this year, Crossplay. It's our first multiplayer game. We cared a lot about retention. It was sort of our focus all through soft launch. It's what we measured against, but we weren't then also looking at extreme monetization or some of the other metrics. We didn't care as much about DAO. We were really focused on sort of a set that was concentrated. And we had benchmarks for those that we had set through external primarily for that. And when we think about new games, we have a benefit of some internal comps, but I think it's hard when you don't know where you're going. And so you have to have that path. You have to have a North Star and a benchmark.
Interesting. So would you say it is really valuable to pick only one metric here, or do you have like a small set of it? Because I can
Yeah,
see like developers care about everything, and there's always a
right.
trade-off. So do you come up with a set, or is it better to just focus on the one that you think for this phase, this is the one I should focus on?
You can come up with a set. I think, like you're gonna look at all of them, and I'm not gonna say, don't. But if you are trying to say improve retention's what you care about, and then you also match, DAO and installs with that. Oftentimes those come at sort of opposing costs because, like, you could pay a lot and have a bunch of installs come in and tank your retention as a result just because of the quality of install. Or you could care a lot about the installs that you have and really focus on retention. And so those metrics can start to oppose each other depending on the levers that you pull. And so I think it is hard to try to move all of them at the same time. When I say like retention as a general metric, that includes all types. It's velocity, D7 over D1, D30 over D7, et cetera. Those are all included in these, but you kind of have to start weighing them. And like, what is your goal? If your goal is to have a game that people stick around and play, frequently day after day, then you may need to pick one over the other.
That's very interesting. Yeah. And you mentioned comps, so like comparing it to other data points, other games that you might have internal and external. Of course, studios earlier on in their lifetime will have less internal comparison points. So, how do you pick what to compare against when you go outside? What is kind of like your usual process for this? What have you found that really works for you?
I think the external comps is an interesting one. We have different style of games. And so these days there's sort of no shortage for, I think you said the studio who asked this was a match 3 prototype. There are other match 3 games. And so, there are tools that can give you that external information that can be really beneficial just for understanding what is a typical volume of downloads, or what is a typical retention, or how are they sort of behaving in the market. You're not going to probably hit the same as, some of the bigger ones, but what are their rates? What are their cadences? How does yours move against it? And also it helps you set a benchmark, right? When I say like, oh, you should probably set a D1 retention goal, that's a way to do it. What are other D1 retentions or anticipated retentions that these other types of games that are similar to yours have? I think it's beneficial at least to level set in your brain. If a typical match 3 game has a D1 retention of say 30%, and you're aiming for 45, like that's going to be a real challenge. And so you sort of have to also be realistic about what is the baseline here, what is the goal. And then on the internal side, like obviously the Times is a benefit of we make a lot of games. We also test a lot of games. We had a beta that unfortunately did not move past. It won't be joining our portfolio permanently. We've had a series of beta tests before. And so we were able to do direct comparison, but then we are also rethinking how do we go one level deeper. And we've built a model that looks at the addition of this game into our portfolio. What are the benefits of it? We do this through statistical analysis, in which we effectively create sort of like an A/B test with this beta without actually creating an A/B test. And we're able to do direct group comparison between the two. And so they're like interesting ways that you can start to get at isolating the effect of your game or understanding your game through external comps, internal comps, statistical analysis.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense that in the beginning you're looking more at the what's out there, and there's more out there. Even though these games are such an enclosed ecosystem and everybody's in charge of their own data, there's still enough shared, right, that even smaller studios can have access to. I also personally just reaching out to people, going to conferences or watching the video podcast on the internet, really helpful with the kind of information that is being shared there. I agree. But then, of course, once it goes internal and you can compare it to your own data, it gets much more precise. And as far as I understand you have kind of like specific groupings and data sets to make it as comparable as possible, even though the games are slightly different. Interesting. Yeah. So once I have this kind of a North Star number that I'm going after, I have kind of in mind where the goals that I want to be. Maybe not the top 50 games, but for the phase your game is in, I want to reach this, and I have data coming in, but it's not really supporting it in a way. How do I start getting to that data? How is this process of seeing the numbers coming in and then trying to work on these numbers and improving them?
I should start by saying it's a lot harder to move a metric than I think we give credit for. There's a lot of risk involved in deciding that that's what you're going to do. That, maybe your retention is low and you have to act on it. But you don't know how, and you're scared to hurt what you have. I think we talk a lot about adopting an experimentation mindset when it comes to new games generally, and also the statistical rigor that we have behind new games, because you're gonna move the needle the furthest with your biggest bet. If you're scared of retention, you have to try something really bold in order to move it. Like a 5% change in something is not going to have the same impact as a 25% change. And so if you're sitting with your new game and you're worried about your North Stars is retention and you have to move it, it's not doing too hot, the way that you're going to do that is not through like these small incremental changes. Like with experimentation, if you try your biggest bet, you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. And that'll tell you sort of what problem that you're having. Is it like the game itself, the setup, the sort of design, whatever? Is it the gameplay that's having a problem? Depending on where you're testing, obviously, but that'll give you a good sense of what is like the max that we can go for. And then if that still doesn't work, then maybe there's more consideration that needs to happen. Once you get that and you start to hit up against the, okay, we've moved the needle as far as we can by trying our biggest bets, is when you can start to refine. But if your big thing or your big change isn't doing that, isn't causing any difference, you need to consider maybe some bigger, maybe changes overall, or like core gameplay changes or something a little bit different. Not saying abandon ship, but take a hard look at sort of what is it that is not making your big bet work. We had an example in our most recent game that we beta tested. We were seeing some not great things. It was a level-based game. We decided to cut quite a few levels, like hypothesis being, okay, maybe the solve rate is too low and we're worried about people losing interest. And so we did the big thing, which was, cutting levels, like a fundamental part of the game, just to test if that worked. And, there's sort of an agreement of, okay, if this doesn't do what we think it does, then we need to sort of have a harder look at the game itself and whether or not this is the right move forward for us. And I think, making that decision is really hard, I suppose. But it'll give you the most indication.
Totally, yeah. I hear that from hyper casual developers a lot. Which they call the kill your babies mentality is like for them it's even shorter cycles, so they have to move on very quickly. But what you say is you have to do big changes. You cannot just rely on little iterations, but you have to be ready that your game might be significantly different from what you set out with once it is out there and becoming successful, and you might have not to worry too much about the users you have in the beginning to be able to make those changes.
Yeah, and I think just be willing to adapt. And I think as soon as it moves too far from what your original goal is, you have a gut instinct of saying, this is maybe not the game that we designed.
Yeah, definitely. So I make my major changes and I see a big improvement on my North Star number that I've set. But at the same time, I see maybe that has affected other things, right? Like maybe my short-term retention is much better because I cut a bunch of levels, but then suddenly my long-term retention is suffering because there's less kind of like immediately accessible content for my players or something else, right? Like playtime per session goes up, but overall retention goes down. Or maybe your experimentation goes the wrong way. Your North Star is much worse, but everything else looks better. How do you kind of deal with these trade-offs, and how do you know that you're moving in the right direction?
There's sort of two parts to this. One is, like, we have wonderful researchers here that I also collaborate with quite a bit, which is what are the people thinking about these changes as well? And that always goes like kind of hand in hand with data. And then just from a data perspective, I think that's where it becomes hairy, where like setting those benchmarks and setting those North Stars is really helpful. Because if your North Star is the one getting hit and all of your secondary metrics are mildly improving, then it's easy to go, okay, well, this is our North Star now. Now that this thing is going well, this is our North Star. And I think you have to sort of stay the course on, we hit the worst thing. We caused harm to not the one thing, or the series of metrics that we care the most about right now. And I would also think about, where did you test, right? Or where did you try your big bet? If you're trying your big bet on the onboarding flow and for some reason, D7 gets hit, I would probably dig a lot deeper onto why that was. Like, did the user not learn enough in those first couple of days to understand the gameplay at day 7? How did they even get to day 7? Was our progression funnel like really, really good, but our onboarding flow bad? Where is it actually happening? And what part of your game was it actually meant to influence? Because, if I try something in my progression funnel, and for some reason that's affecting D1 return, I would expect a lot more of my onboarding funnel to affect D1, not necessarily what's going on in my later progression funnel. So why is that? Where is that coming from? And then you can dig in. I think your metrics moving opposite each other also tells you where to look at a minimum. I think I'm basically saying that don't change your North Star just because your numbers flipped around, but dig into like, where is it that this is actually happening? I will say, if your big bet worked and moved anything, there's a lot more tweaking you can do. I think you should become scared when it doesn't actually do anything. That's when maybe you have a bigger problem on your hands and you need to like dig deeper. So I think there's always learnings that can come from anything changing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like the iterations never stop, especially when things are going well. You want to get them go better, but if nothing moves, then yeah, smaller iterations won't make any sense from
Yeah.
that point. Even less so than starting out with them, right?
Yeah. You can't move an immovable object. And so I would get the most scared when things just stop moving.
Yeah, for sure. And even if it flips the other way around, then maybe doing the opposite of what you've just done
Yeah.
might be up. At least there's more stuff you can play with than having no data at
Yeah.
all that tells you what happened. All right, so I do my tests, going a step further in this process. I did something, it made a big swing. I see numbers improving. I'm feeling okay, now we're getting somewhere with this game. But then I'm also looking at my DAU numbers about new users coming in. I'm still in the testing phase. I don't want to rely on big campaigns yet. I don't want to burn too many people before I'm kind of sure that what I've built works, especially at a bigger scale. If I have this limited, like I have data points coming in, but from a limited amount of users, how reliable is it? What does it depend on? Is it just the number of users? Is it the markets they're coming from? How do you break that down? And how do you make sure that what you see in testing is actually applicable to the wider release of the game?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Like, size of your audience is hugely important for your reliability of your metrics. You have just massive variability when you have smaller audiences. And so, um, if you're looking at a metric on a day-to-day basis and your DAU is a couple thousand, maybe, like you're gonna have fluctuations that can look really scary. But it's sort of taking a step back and saying, okay, what is the trend here? What is my variability? Are my standard deviations? What does the distribution look like? Like, is this variability normal for the size of audience that I have? Now, if you have a really massive audience, you also have variability. It compacts a lot more because you just have a lot more people. It's still there, but then smaller changes have a more meaningful effect. And so you sort of have another problem of a 5% change in your key metric when you have a couple thousand people is dramatic, but it's 50 people versus if you have a million people and you have a 5% change, it starts to impact like those volumes a lot more. So your DAU is up and down, but it is on both cases. And so when you're trying to say improve those, you have different risk that you're willing to take. I can handle a risk of 50 people. You're at a million, that all of a sudden becomes like 50,000 and you're like, that's actually scary for me. Even though, you would think it's the same, sort of percentage difference. Like I mentioned, we have a model that sort of builds two user groups and compares them, one with the game and one without. And that's just allowed us to sort of isolate, like, what is the incremental benefit of all of these? And to get to statistical significance in that, you need to have a certain volume. And so you can either change your metric a lot more in order to see an effect. A 10% change or is not the same as a 60% change. If you got a 60% change in a metric, that's crazy. I don't know what you did, but like for the sake of an example. Or you can have more people. And like usually what that means is time.
Yeah, that's very interesting how in this beginning phase you have the luxury of being able to make these big changes because it doesn't affect like a player base that you have and rely on to a certain extent. But it's also time is a luxury. So you want to be eventually be coming out with your game. So the longer you delay by doing more tests, the bigger the changes get for every test, the thinner the air gets maybe on a project, right? So it's pretty hard to decide when do I go from like big pivots, big changes, major overhauls into smaller iterations. Is there kind of like a
Mm.
guideline or something? How would you decide when is it time? Like when did you do enough to go into smaller iterations and maybe start getting more new users into the game as well?
I think just going back to like if your changes or your effects, especially your bigger ones, stop moving any metrics. You're like, we're fighting over a 0.5% change in D1. That is not as helpful to put in more time. If you're talking about when do we make the decision to go out, exhaust your options probably on like what your big bets are. If you stop seeing things move, that's probably a good sign that like either this is sort of the state of your current game and you need to either be comfortable with going live with that, or you need to sort of go back, think more on the concept, think more on the gameplay. What is the core problem? And then once you've hit that point, you can say, okay, we're going to go out. And once you have more people, you can spend more time in those smaller areas. And you get, a million downloads and you're like, I now have a million people that I can test my Fatui with. I wasn't able to detect that before because I only had 20,000 people in my game, and we would have had to run for 6 months in order to test a change or like consider a change to move that metric 0.05 or whatever. The point is you can always try to be like making those incremental changes, and you could get stuck in that loop, and it's really expensive to get stuck in that loop. Testing is not cheap. It is really great, and it's like the best tool I think to come to product development, but there's always risk involved in that as well. I mean, like when we test new betas here, we talk all the time of like, we don't do it globally anymore because it also hurts when you take things away. Like you're introducing and taking things away from people. There's a reaction to that. And there's a sort of trust you need to build with your audience as well. And so you kind of need to get to a point where you're comfortable, you think the audience is comfortable, and then you can sort of test these smaller things once you start to roll out and hopefully grow your audience.
Yeah, it's pretty defining what North Star you picked and like what level, what KPI you kind of expected to be at when you hit that number, right? Because the need for a bigger change is directly connected to that. Like, how close am I to this goal? Is
Right.
the smaller change still worth getting there? What if I am a little bit further away and I want to identify the problems, especially having these two scenarios, being very early, having very few players, and then maybe having a bigger, like 500,000 to 1 million players, nothing huge but sizable. Would you go differently when it comes to identifying the issues and working on them? Or do you say like, oh, when it's that few players, don't focus in too much on little issues, but just do the big change and not trying to find the tutorial step that's the issue, just throw out the tutorial and have a new one or something like that?
I definitely don't want to say never go for the little things when it comes to like refining, but if you're really far off, you just got to go for the big swing. I think like we've established that you're way behind, try the big thing. If that doesn't move it, these tiny things aren't. So I think you can break it down into user funnel or like player funnels or funnels within your game. And I think your metrics can align with different parts of that. I think we mentioned, let's say your onboarding funnel, your first time user experience funnel, your D1 is going to be way more affected by that than any of your progression or gameplay. And so I think that that's the case whether you have a small audience or a big audience. I think understanding like what that impact is, understand your distribution of your D1, what is a reasonable metric for your D1 based off of your user group. All you're doing really is like stretching and pulling at your distribution. If you have a really large database, your distribution for your D1 is going to look super skinny, right? You're going to have an average, let's say your D1 average is 35%. You're right here and it moves maybe 1% on either side, or maybe 0.5%, or maybe you even get it down to like 0.25% on either side of 35. Like that's what having a big audience does. But let's say you have a smaller audience, your distribution just kind of goes like this. And so you're still at 35, your average is still 35, which is really wonderful, but maybe it fluctuates like 5% or 10% even on some days, depending how small your audience is. If your D1, flips 10% day to day, you should be comfortable with that.
Yeah.
But like understanding your distributions and like getting to know them and saying, okay, like 5%, yes, that is like on the surface scary, but we're gonna end up back at this 35%. And so you still understand things at lower audience size, but the only way to shrink sort of this distribution to something like this is that time component. If you're not expanding into another geo in your soft launch, or you're not yet willing to maybe expand in some way to get that early on. And if you're really insisting, we just want to test in this one geo because we're really nervous about like expanding that too early, you just got to be comfortable then with what that variability looks like on either end and that fatter distribution. And eventually, over time and as you come out, like hopefully your distribution goes like this. And then you can focus on, okay, let's move it over here, or like, let's move it over here and let's move that mean. That's where you can start to finely tune a little bit more.
Yeah, that probably calms the nerves of a lot of developers that have this bell curve, but they're like, okay, what if I add 100,000 new people and they're all at the lower end of this bell curve? But it's less likely to happen from what I understand. It's probably going to even out to something more similar to what you're seeing already.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely matters on how you're bringing these people in, right? If you keep, this is sometimes everything's still the same. Your average is going to be the same if sort of everything typically stays similar. If you go out and you spend a lot on acquisition, like, yes, your curve is going to probably move. That's just typical. When you start changing those user cohorts, maybe for some reason, all of a sudden, one type of game goes super viral and everyone's obsessed with match 3 games again, but like 90% of the world is playing it. That's when you start having, these influences from outside. And that's why it's also important to understand who you're working with. Like we talk a lot about who's coming in and our existing game base, because like we do have very loyal people, and we're very lucky in that. But do we trust them necessarily to tell us like how a game is going to grow in the rest of the world? No, not necessarily. It's really important that we understand them and we hope that what we're introducing is like beneficial to them. But you also need to think about what the greater organic growth might look like. And that's not necessarily going to look like our most loyal people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If you have a game with a brand and all of your first players are people that are very familiar with that brand and love that brand, they will not behave the same way as somebody completely outside. And then that, of course, is the same for other target groups, other age groups, paid versus organic, and so on. So I can definitely see that changing.
Yeah.
So we're at a stage now where we've done a lot of tests. We got the game where we want it to be. Now things get less wild, no big changes anymore. You have your core audience in there, people that have been with your game for a long time. You're seeing longer retention numbers. When you're at this point, how do you approach changes then? Is it still worth experimenting, but to what extent? And does your approach change at that point where you're like, these are my people, they're already in my game, but how do I make their experience maybe the best I can do?
Yeah, I think it's first identifying when you hit that point, which is hard to do. Hopefully you launch your game, you have marketing, everything comes in, and maybe you have a bit of a shark fin, you have that like peak of new users that starts to go down. Identifying that point in which you reach sort of consistent new user base on a day-to-day basis is when you've sort of started to hit okay, this is BAU, this is business as usual. This is like what we're going to hopefully be working with for the next few months. Or maybe something happens and you have another like little blip or shark fin, but like, what is that base? Which you don't want to be like, when are we going to hit the bottom? I would love to find the bottom, but that's when you need to start saying, okay, now that we're here, now let's look at D1 and D7 and D30. Let's like reevaluate those like core metrics. It's also when you can start introducing maybe more monetization. You can start caring about your DAU a bit if you're part of the growth component. But let's focus on retention. What does that D1 look like? Is your velocity the same as it is when you first launched? Where are your new concrete baselines, and who are your players, and who are you working with? How do you segment all of these people? What are they doing on a day-to-day basis? I think it's like you have to refamiliarize yourself with what's even happening. It's sort of like you go into launch, you have a bit of an expectation, and you hopefully meet what you were seeing in soft launch, but then you also need to be willing to sort of reset a lot of those expectations and rethink what those distributions look like. Like I just mentioned, your soft launch distribution is going to look like this, but like hopefully when you launch, it like tightens up like this. Okay, now moving that is still going to be challenging, but we have a lot more people to do it with. I think it's an exciting time, like once you hit that point. And also, I'd say experiment always. Like, if you really need to move a metric, think of the big thing. Like, I know you also had an episode about A/B testing, which was really wonderful, in which it was very much like small inputs are going to get small outputs and vice versa. Big inputs are going to get bigger outputs. That mindset never really goes away. And you have to be willing to iterate. And if you start to slow down and nothing's moving, that time is not the time for copy changes, or let's look at what if we change this from a dark purple to a light purple. Like there are times for those, and those are like really great. And like I say, if you have the ability and the audience to A/B test that frequently and that iteratively, do it. I think there's always a learning from it. But you also need to be cautious and reactive to what your user base is telling you.
I think that beautifully brings us full circle back to what we've been talking about this whole thing, like dream big, make big changes, don't be afraid, have a clear North Star. I think this is one of the most important points, like define what you want to go for and then make big changes until you get there. Don't just try to change the color a little bit and hope you will see major improvement. And don't be afraid of still be doing that later on the road if the situation calls for it. If you have the luxury not to do it, like do your small iterations, but don't be afraid of still throwing a little curveball here or there at your audience and see what you can do with the numbers. Once you identified who you're actually doing it for, you can also be more precise when it comes to tailoring it to the people playing your game. Awesome. Thank you so much for being here with us today. It was super insightful. I think it's going to be really helpful for both the person asking the questions, but just studios in general when they have new games, new prototypes, and trying to see where they are with it and kind of have a little bit of a guideline to follow when it comes to collecting data and then making decisions based on that. It was super insightful. I learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. This has been so fun.